Dr. Igor Grant is a distinguished professor of psychiatry in the School of Health Sciences at University of California, San Diego. He's a neurophysicist who trained at the University of British Columbia and the University of Pennsylvania, and whose research interests include the effects of various diseases and abuse of drugs and alcohol on the brain and behavior, as well as psychobiological effects of chronic stress on the elderly. Since 2000, Dr. Igor Grant has been a director of the State of California-funded Center of Medical Cannabis Research, the CMCR. And today he's going to bring us up to date on the state of medical cannabis.
Today, I'd like to talk to you more about medical applications of the cannabinoid, provide you a little bit of a historic background, some context for California specifically, where the first ever really Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research was established, and then end with some thoughts for future directions. As this audience will know, cannabis exists in many forms, at least as it's available to people. And that it was actually a medicine until the 1930s that was approved in the US Pharmacopoeia. Here's just an image of Cannabis Americana, which was marketed by the Eli Lilly company. You'll notice that it's physiologically tested, it's American grown, has analgesic, hypnotic, antispasmodic, and powerful narcotic properties. And it turns out that some of these claims actually are now being established to be true. So for a long time, there was really not a lot of research on medicinal cannabis that had to do with it being classified as a narcotic and then being scheduled as a Schedule I drug in the United States, meaning that it was a dangerous drug and had no particular evidence of medical benefit. However, beginning in the 90s, there was a resurgence of interest, and it really resulted from a confluence of several factors. One, of course, is persistent anecdotal evidence that marijuana was helping people, particularly people with HIV who had neuropathic pain and symptoms of that nature. There were also political shifts which have really accelerated favoring medicinal cannabis access. This slide is a little bit dated. I'll show you in the map that follows that now the majority of states have at least a medicinal cannabis law of some sort, and a number are now outright legalizing marijuana use. So, and beyond the political shifts, there were also important discoveries in neurobiology, which included the discovery of CB1 and CB2 receptors, which are the sites at which THC and some other cannabinoids act. There was then the discovery of endogenous neurotransmitters, or not just neurotransmitters, but endogenous signaling molecules that acted on these receptors, and the ones that are now accepted are anandamide and 2-AG. There probably are other signaling molecules as well. There may also be other cannabinoid receptors that we just haven't discovered yet. And then, of course, there has been the development of synthetic molecules, including agonists, partial agonists, antagonists, and other modifiers, such as inhibitors of fatty acid amide hydrolase, or FAAH, which we will talk about a little bit later again. Now, this is the more updated situation in regard to cannabis legalization by state. As you can see, 33, as of 2018 at least, 33 states and the District of Columbia have medical marijuana laws. Recreational use has been now approved in 10 jurisdictions, including Puerto Rico and Guam. And it's really only 4 states that have no public access marijuana programs at the moment. These are just simplified cartoons to remind us where CB receptors are distributed. In this case, these are CB1 receptors. As you can see, they are highly concentrated in different parts of the central nervous system, but also in other body systems, the gut, liver, and other organ systems. Now, the effects of the endocannabinoids and also specifically THC on brain and behavior can be really deduced from looking at the distribution of these receptors. And so, as you can see, we find them heavily represented in the parts of the cerebellum, for example. So naturally, motor control and coordination are affected by use of marijuana. We know that memory functions can be affected, at least acutely, and that relates to hippocampal CB1 receptors, and so on and so forth. The structures of the 2 commonly accepted endocannabinoids, anandamide and 2-AG, are presented here. As I say, there may be others as well. Now, the endocannabinoid system is a little bit different than usual neurotransmitter systems in that the main function seems to be kind of a circuit breaker or modulating function on other transmitter systems. So in this particular example, if we are looking at the release of a transmitter such as GABA or glutamate, that triggers postsynaptic release of 2-AG or anandamide, which then acts to modify the initial function. So in the case of glutamatergic systems, this would reduce excitability, or in the case of GABAergic, it would reduce downregulation of the system. In terms of the marijuana compounds, we know that there are many dozens of cannabinoids, at least 80. The original psychoactive ingredient, THC, was characterized by Raphael Mechoulam, an Israeli scientist who is still active at this point, actually, and was helpful in the initial establishment of our center as an advisor. He and his colleagues also characterized CBD. Now, I started with somewhat of a historic overview, and what I indicated was that there were a number of confluences that stimulated interest in cannabis as a medicine in the 90s. And this led to a series of reviews and reports by the National Academies of Sciences. Initially, they had a report in 1999 that identified appetite stimulation, control of nausea and vomiting, analgesia, and potentially control of certain kinds of neurological and movement disorders as places where cannabinoids might have a place. So at about this time, California passed the first medical marijuana law called the Compassionate Use Act, and that then led directly to the creation of our own University of California Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research. So the actual Compassionate Use Act was passed in 1996 by initiative. And then in 1999, the enabling legislation for the CMCR was established, and the center itself began its work a year later. Now, one thing that is important to recognize, and often people don't understand, is that simply because there's a medical marijuana law, or now even legalization of marijuana in different states and jurisdictions, doesn't mean that investigators can actually use these products to do research. The only legal source of cannabis for medical studies is from the federal government itself, National Institute on Drug Abuse, which has a contract with the University of Mississippi to provide these products. And the chart before you just shows that it's complicated, that if an investigator wished to do a study, and here I'm just illustrating what happened at the CMCR, if we received a proposal, let's say from an investigator at UC Davis to do a study of patients with certain kinds of pain, we would then have an internal review at our center with external advisors. Assuming the proposal was judged meritorious, we would then need to coordinate with the state, which has a research advisory panel for California, RAPC, and that controls any narcotic type drug research in the state, and also with the federal government. In the initial phases of our work, there was actually a review process that had to be gone through by the Department of Human Services, DHHS, NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse. This particular part of the review has now been deleted in several years, but what does remain at the federal level is that the FDA and the DEA have to provide their review and approvals. On the DEA side, there's actually a review in Washington, and there's also a local review. That is, that, for example, in San Diego, the local DEA agents have to come out and be satisfied that conditions for storage of product and distribution are satisfactory, that there's protection against diversion, and so forth. So why do I show this? It's just to say that, in part, one reason why research on medicinal cannabis has been somewhat slow is that the process is complicated and requires a fair amount of resources. So, for example, in the situation of the UC Davis investigator who submitted a proposal to to the CMCR, once we approved the proposal, it took an average of another year for the proposal to clear all the regulatory channels. CMCR itself has funded studies throughout California. You can see on the map where some of those took place. And now I want to talk a little bit about what kinds of studies were done and what were the principal findings. Basically, all the studies were short-term studies with relatively small sample sizes, not exceeding 50 patients, for example, or participants. And here's an example of a study that Dr. Donald Abrams performed at UC San Francisco. So his project wanted to look at the possible value of medicinal cannabis in the treatment of neuropathic pain in persons with HIV/AIDS. Neuropathic pain is a common complication, particularly as people advance more to actual AIDS diagnosis. Treatments are not terrific using traditional agents, so there is a need to have additional avenues of therapy. Now, what Dr. Abrams did was admitted people with neuropathic pain to a research unit at San Francisco General Hospital. They had a 2-day inpatient stabilization where they received assessments of their pain. Then they were randomized to either a smoked marijuana that contained 4% THC or smoked marijuana which had no THC in it. Then those were they were treated for 5 days and then followed for another 7 days after that. What you can see is comparing the yellow curves, which are the placebo marijuana, to the red curve, which are the patients who got the 4% THC containing cigarettes, that there was a significant difference in reduction of pain. And that benefit lasted actually for several days after patients had stopped their treatment. So studies like this, there were actually 6 studies conducted by CMCR, different variations on a theme of short-term intervention with people with neuropathic pain. All ended up being positive. And so from this table, you can see some of the examples of these studies. You can see that one study actually used healthy volunteers with experimentally induced pain. Others had HIV neuropathy or neuropathic pain of other kinds, including diabetic. And you can see what kinds of doses of THC were involved. The interesting point is that all studies produced positive results, that is, people benefited in the short term. One other study concerned muscle MS spasticity, and that also showed a positive result. We accept for a moment that, at least in the short term, these medicinal cannabis preparations were helpful. How do they compare with existing treatments of neuropathic pain? So one way to assess this is to compute some indicator like number needed to treat, which, as you can see, is the inverse of the proportion who improved in the experimental condition minus the proportion who improved on placebo. So, for example, if we think that a 30% reduction in severity of pain qualifies for improved, and if 60% of people receiving the active treatment improve, while 30% of those receiving placebo improve, then 0.6 minus 0.3 equals 0.3, and 1 over 0.3 equals 3.3. So 3.3 represents the NNT. It goes to reason that the way this is calculated, that the lower the NNT, the more powerful the drug. So how does marijuana stack up? The tricyclic antidepressants, which are the old line antidepressants such as amitriptyline, which is Elavil, and imipramine, which is Tofranil, are actually pretty good agents, probably the best in managing this kind of pain. And so their NNT was 2.2, and then you can see that cannabis was about similar to gabapentin, a commonly used agent, and seems to outperform lamotrigine and certainly the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor antidepressants. So it is modestly effective, at least in the short term. Um, the other interesting thing was that rather low doses of THC seem to be efficacious. And so one thing that Dr. Barth Wilsey, who at that time was at UC Davis actually, found was even concentrations below 2% THC showed improvement. And these are concentrations that are quite a bit less than any serious-minded marijuana user would want to ingest in order to get a really good high. So I guess what I'm saying is that it may be the case that there is a dissociation or that the window for therapeutic efficacy involves quite a bit lower drug concentrations than people would want in order to get high. So you can separate out the undesirable effects potentially from the therapeutic effects, at least to some degree. And by the way, this is not unusual in therapy. I mentioned the tricyclic antidepressants a moment ago as being good treatments for neuropathic pain. But it turns out that the doses of the antidepressants that one gives are quite a bit lower than the antidepressant doses. So just as an example, we might give 50 or 75 milligrams of amitriptyline or imipramine for neuropathic pain, whereas we need 200, 250 milligrams of the same drugs to treat serious depression. So just to wrap this part up then, what's the summary of what we found? We found that at least in the short term, medicinal cannabis was helpful in the treatment of neuropathic pain. And also one study found efficacy for spasticity and multiple sclerosis. The side effects were generally mild, and the commonest ones being what you would expect: feeling high, a little bit dizzy. Many people experienced tachycardia, rapid heart rate that is, feeling a little bit tired, and so forth. But these side effects, at least at the doses that we were using, were not rate limiting. That is, we didn't have to stop the treatment because the side effects were so profound. We also performed neuropsychological testing with these patients, and there were, as you would expect, while the person was taking the drug, some reductions in attention, memory, certain kinds of neurocognitive functions. But these decrements were small and reversed once the treatment was stopped. Probably the effect was not very different than you might expect from a moderate dose of, say, benzodiazepine in this case. So, in any event, the summary is that there were apparent beneficial effects in the short term. Side effects were modest, and this means that these are drugs worthy of continuing to study. Now, in 2017, the National Academies came out with a new report, and basically their conclusions based on a massive literature review were very similar to what I've just said based on our CMCR studies. They noted that there was substantial to conclusive evidence of cannabinoid efficacy in chronic pain, spasticity, and control of nausea. They also noted moderate evidence of cannabinoid efficacy in improving sleep, particularly in persons with pain. And then they rated as limited evidence of efficacy in the treatment of certain anxiety disorders and promoting appetite and weight gain. and at that point thought there was not sufficient evidence for some other putative applications, including epilepsy. Now, of course, we know now that actually the cannabinoids can be useful in the treatment of certain kinds of epilepsy, which I'll come to in a moment. Now, of course, while we might conclude that at least there's some evidence for medicinal cannabis's efficacy, there are problems in its use, at least in society as it's currently situated. First of all, if one were to continue to prescribe cannabis in its smoked form, there's the obvious risk that combustible material could be dangerous in a clinical setting. Let's say next to an oxygen tank or something, that's obvious, but also the issues of secondhand smoke, tolerability of smoking to people who maybe never have smoked. So these are all problems with smoking as a delivery system. Nevertheless, for those people who are experienced with marijuana and who might wish to take cannabis in its smoked form, in principle, there shouldn't be any reason why they should not be allowed to do that, as long as it can be done safely without harming other people. Of course, there are other problems, conflict with anti-drug laws, possibility of misuse and diversion, and I've mentioned already that there is the difficulty of conducting just clinical research with Schedule I drugs. But that may change, it seems like, with some changes in Congress. I would expect that there will be a rescheduling of cannabis, and particularly some of the constituents, to a schedule that makes study much more possible. Now, continuing on the issue of how cannabis is ingested, of course the kinetics are very different. If one takes cannabis as an inhaled, smoked, or other inhaled mechanism versus by mouth. And you can see in the left-hand slide that THC, for example, peaks very quickly when marijuana is smoked, and then disappears within 30 minutes to an hour to very low concentrations in plasma. On the other hand, if one takes marijuana by mouth, you can see that concentrations are lower in the green line, and due to delays in absorption and first-pass metabolism, it may take a longer time to reach a maximum level. Also, you will note in the dotted line in the right-hand slide the rise in 11-hydroxy-THC, which is a psychoactive metabolite of THC, and that may arguably create a stronger high in some cases in people who take marijuana by mouth. 11-hydroxy-THC is not produced when the liver is bypassed by inhaling or smoking. Now, there are a number of devices for vaporizing marijuana if one wanted to avoid smoking, and these are just a few of them. There are probably many, many more. We did some studies with this device affectionately known as the Volcano, and what it does is really heats the plant product to a subcombustion temperature so that there isn't smoke or burning, but the cannabinoids are volatilized and released into a balloon that the person can inhale from. And what Dr. Wilsey and even before that, Dr. Donald Abrams showed is that, first of all, you do get decent concentrations of THC in plasma. And secondly, that the vaporized form is efficacious in the treatment of neuropathic pain in this instance. So you can see that people who received both the 3.5% THC containing vapor and the 1.3% both reported improvement. And this, by the way, again, emphasizes a point I wanted to make before, which is that rather low doses of THC seem to provide benefit for neuropathic pain, at least. Doses which are not likely to make people very impaired cognitively or feel an undesirable high. Now, in another effort to deliver cannabinoids more efficiently, that is bypassing the gut and first-pass metabolism that I mentioned before, companies have been developing oral mucosal sprays. This is an example of the GW Pharmaceuticals device to deliver, in this case, Sativex, which is a mix of CBD and THC extracted from the cannabis plant. And so this is delivered as a 0.1 ml spray into the mouth. It was, yes, and so these Sativex preparations have also been studied and have been shown to also improve neuropathic pain and muscle spasticity in MS, just like with the inhaled marijuana product. So here is an example of one such study that looked at nabiximols, which is the generic name for Sativex, for neuropathic pain. Now, there is, of course, growing interest also in cannabinoids that may be therapeutic that do not have the psychoactive effects of THC, and the psychoactive effects may not be desired in a number of treatment situations. By the way, whether it's desired or not is a little bit of a complex question. So, for example, whereas if we're trying to treat neuropathic pain in a person who has a steady job or drives a truck or something like this, obviously having the psychoactive effect is not desirable since it can impair function. On the other hand, if we're treating someone with terminal cancer who also has pain, it may be that the psychoactive effect may be desired by that patient in terms of reducing anxiety, producing more calmness, having much more of a sense of disconnection, maybe even. So it's not necessarily the case that the psychoactive effect is, quote, bad. It obviously is not desired or should not be encouraged in a setting where it's dangerous. So some of the approaches to developing cannabinoid-based therapeutics also look at developing synthetic agonists. Of course, THC itself is an agonist. Synthetic THC has been developed in the form of dronabinol or Marinol. Nabilone is another knockoff drug. There have also been developed antagonists. And here the idea would be that if, for example, THC stimulates appetite, then something that blocks perhaps the CB1 receptors might be a good appetite suppressant for people who need to lose weight. And indeed, this is the case. Drugs like rimonabant and taranabant um, are effective in weight loss programs. However, they are not used now because of a serious side effect that has developed, which is depression. However, I think that there will be more effort along these lines. And then, of course, there is the approach of modifying endocannabinoid metabolism itself. And one example is inhibition of enzymes which break down the endocannabinoids. So you can basically enhance an endocannabinoid effect by reducing its degradation. And Fa inhibitors or monoglycerol lipase inhibitors are examples of such approaches. Now, I want to spend a few minutes on cannabidiol, which has acquired a lot of popular interest. Cannabidiol, as you can see, looks not too dissimilar from THC, has a similar terpene and phenolic backbone. But due to some of its modifications, it does not have a psychoactive effect, and nor does it act actually at CB1 and CB2 receptors. So I'll talk in a moment about what are some putative mechanisms of CBD action. But before we do that, I want to just go over some of the potential applications of CBD. First, it is, along with THC, one of the abundant cannabinoids. Some of the applications that have been suggested have been the possibility that it has an anti-inflammatory effect, also analgesic, possibly antiemetic, hypnotic and sedative effects. There's even some work on CBD as an antipsychotic. It's shown to be useful as an anticonvulsive. I'll show you that in a moment. Maybe anxiolytic, maybe neuroprotective. There could be other effects. Again, as to how it works, we really don't know. We do know, as I said a moment ago, that CB1 and CB2 receptors are probably not involved. There is some evidence that CBD desensitizes TRP channels, such as TRPV1, so-called vanilloid receptors, and possibly that desensitization is part of the anti-nociceptive or the analgesic effect, particularly if the pain is due to an inflammatory condition. There's some evidence that blocks this orphan receptor GPR55, which might also play a role in neuropathic and inflammatory pain. CBD may enhance glycine receptor activity, and potentially that's one of the bases for its anticonvulsant actions. It may inhibit this enzyme I mentioned earlier, Fa, which degrades endocannabinoids or anandamide. And so to the extent CBD does that, it may actually increase the availability of anandamide. Also, CBD probably enhances the 5-HT1A serotonin receptor, and perhaps that is one of the bases for its anxiolytic effect and potentially even antipsychotic effects. There's been a fair amount of speculation as to whether mixtures of THC and CBD modify in some way the effects of THC itself. In other words, could people be less stoned if CBD was added to the mix of cannabis medicines that contain THC? There isn't actually strong evidence for that, although there's a little bit. And if it did turn out to be the case, it's possible that CBD's modulation of the cytochrome P452C metabolism to a more psychoactive 11-hydroxy form, which is what I mentioned before, talking about oral administration. So if there is less metabolism to that active form, maybe that could explain some of CBD's modulating effects of THC. But at the end of the day, we really don't know enough about how CBD works. Here I've just shown, in terms of the anti-seizure activity of CBD, there's actually been quite a lot of particularly preclinical work that is suggestive, and some early clinical work, but it's really very recently that very good evidence for CBD effect as an anti-epileptic has been shown by Dr. Devinsky and others. And they studied on common forms of very serious intractable epilepsies that are known as Lennox-Gastaut syndrome and Dravet syndrome. And here are some data that they published recently on cannabidiol in this Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. As you can see, they studied 120 kids and young adults, gave a fairly high dose of CBD, up to 20 milligrams per kilogram per day. And what they showed was that compared to placebo, there was a significant reduction in seizures and particularly certain kinds of attacks that are characterized by dropping and so forth. So there is decent evidence based on this and similar studies, and it was really on this basis that you may have heard of the approval of Epidiolex. Epidiolex is, again, another GW product. You remember I mentioned Sativex before, which was THC and CBD. Well, Epidiolex is essentially all CBD, again, from a plant extracted source. This Epidiolex is what was used in the Devinsky study. So now the FDA actually has approved Epidiolex as a Schedule 5 drug, which is the least restrictive schedule of any drug that might have any kind of addictive potential for the treatment of kids with these indications. And this is an important step forward because really the availability of Epidiolex means that there could potentially be off-label use of Epidiolex for other kinds of seizures, for example, or other kinds of indications. Now, another possible use of cannabidiol has been in the management of certain psychiatric conditions, including anxiety disorders and schizophrenia. And here are some data from a study actually conducted some time ago, which brought in people with public speaking anxiety and social phobia. Now, people with public speaking anxiety, as the name suggests, do get very nervous if they're asked to deliver a speech. And so what the investigators did is, first of all, compared the anxiety levels of folks with public speaking anxiety when asked to do a speech in the laboratory to controls who did not have public speaking anxiety. And then they treated folks with CBD or placebo. And what these charts show is that in terms of self-ratings of anxiety, which is in the left-hand panel, um, uh, people with anxiety disorders who received CBD, and it's in kind of this blue curve, had a lot less anxiety when asked to do public speaking than they did when they did not receive CBD or receive placebo, rather, which is the red curve. So the red curve is people with public speaking anxiety who were forced to speak, and you can see how their anxiety peaked quite high. When they were treated with CBD, their anxiety wasn't quite the same. And then the controls, which are the orange, of course, didn't have much anxiety by definition. And also, interestingly, on the right-hand panel, you can see that the negative self-statements, that is, people saying to themselves, oh, I did terrible, I'm doing a bad job at this, those almost completely disappeared in the CBD-treated group of the anxiety disorders patients. So anyway, data like this do suggest that CBD may have anxiety ameliorating properties. Also, there's been a little bit of early research on CBD as an antipsychotic. And basically what these charts show, if we just concentrate first on panels A and C, people with schizophrenia were randomized to two treatments. One was cannabidiol, the other was amisulpride, which is an antipsychotic drug. And you can see that both people who received CBD, which are the blue curves in panel A, and amisulpride, which is the dotted red line, had improvements in their various positive and negative symptom scores, as it's called. So panel A is total symptom scores. So whether it's rating psychotic behavior, hallucinations, or negative symptoms, which is not engaging with people, tending to have poor social contact. So, but what was very interesting in panel C is that if you just looked at people with these so-called negative symptoms, that is the more asocial symptoms, CBD actually seemed to outperform the traditional antipsychotic drug. So again, these are all early studies, and it needs to be confirmed, but shows the possibility that CBD may be a useful treatment in schizophrenia. And here, what it really shows is that CBD had fewer bad side effects. One of the problems with typical neuroleptic drugs is they do produce movement disorders and other kinds of neurological symptoms, as well as weight gain. And what these panels show is that, for example, in the extrapyramidal symptoms, which are the neurologic tremors and so forth in panel A, really there was no increase in the CBD-treated group, and there was the expected increase in the amisulpride-treated group. And also in terms of weight gain, which is another undesirable effect of many neuroleptics, CBD was not accompanied by weight gain, whereas amisulpride was. So this basically now brings us to a summary of the status of the field. I think we can say safely that smoked and vaporized cannabis and also extracts containing THC and CBD are probably efficacious in neuropathic pain, muscle spasticity. There's a possible efficacy in sleep disorders treatment. Synthetic THC-like molecules are efficacious in appetite stimulation and control of nausea. So these are molecules like dronabinol. It is possible that other synthetic CB1 agonists will have similar or even more beneficial effects, but this hasn't been established. I've mentioned that CB1 antagonists probably are effective appetite suppressants, but had serious side effects in terms of depression. Cannabidiol, we just talked about, is showing considerable promise in treatment of anxiety, maybe psychosis, and epilepsy. And the FAAH inhibitors in data that I haven't presented are becoming of interest as also possible drugs in the treatment of neuropathic pain. So the public health benefits of medicinal cannabis, there are some that have been reported, such as decreased opioid analgesic overdose deaths, decreased opioid misuse. Decreased obesity has been reported. I'm not sure what the mechanism of action there is, and possible changes in alcohol use, although those findings have been mixed. There are, of course, public health concerns, which are that the presence of medicinal cannabis laws could increase cannabis use in the general population, particularly young people. It's still not clear whether that's true. The epidemiologic studies to date are not long enough to give us an absolute conclusion. Could there be increased use in cannabis use disorders? That is, not just use of cannabis could increase, but problematic use, addictive use. Again, not clear. I mentioned reduced alcohol use in some data, but increased alcohol use in others, so we don't know for sure. Could there be increased motor vehicle accidents? Again, this is a very lively area of study, and data have been inconclusive so far. Increased unintended cannabis overdoses, that's been reported in some case studies of young children getting into cannabis by mistake and becoming toxic. The other is the possibility of crime and criminal activity increasing around medicinal cannabis dispensaries. So these are all issues that need to be considered from a public health perspective as medical marijuana becomes more and more prevalent and even legalization moves ahead. So in terms of, though, medicinal cannabis research, there are some things that really do make life a little bit difficult for the investigator, and if these could be cleared up, we would move faster with understanding both the therapeutic potential and the negative effects of medicinal cannabis. I guess the first thing I would say is we really need to separate out our conversation regarding medicinal cannabis from cannabis legalization, social, recreational use, and so forth. Cannabis, no doubt, is a medicine. We ought to investigate it as a medicine. The fact that it may have negative effects or addictive properties shouldn't stop us from exploring cannabis as a medicine. And then, once we understand that, there can be the appropriate safety checks and regulatory frameworks, just like we have with other medicines that could be abused. We do need, though, more proof of principle studies with applications that haven't been looked at very closely yet, such as PTSD, schizophrenia, potentially anorexia nervosa. There have been some suggestions even of benefit in autism symptoms. All of these things need clinical trials. And then even where the indications are more clear, such as with neuropathic pain, it's very important to look at longer-term studies, because something that may be beneficial in the short term and seemingly not particularly dangerous could in the long term have different problems. May lose efficacy, toxicity may mount. We also need to look at diverse populations. Something that may be safe in a 40-year-old who's otherwise healthy may not be very safe in a 70 or 80-year-old who may have heart problems, diabetes, and so forth. So the issue of rescheduling needs to be considered. And as I said earlier, I really do expect that that will move forward in the next few years because it's currently marijuana sits in a nonsensible schedule. It is not hugely dangerous, and it's not the case that it has no medical value, so it really needs to be moved someplace else. And once that's done, then there will be, I think, a spurt of more research on this topic. The other issues have to do with actually supply of different kinds of cannabis products, those that contain, say, different ratios of THC and CBD, or products that may be administered in different ways, vaporization, oral mucosal spray, by mouth, topical, and so forth. These different formulations have not been studied in any kind of detail, and yet are marketed very vigorously in places where marijuana is legal. In order to develop more of these products, we need more sources that are legal. It cannot be just a single source from the University of Mississippi. They try hard, but they just can't keep up with the demand or provide all of the varieties that may be necessary. And ultimately, we need to get to a point where cannabis, in whatever form, can be prescribed legally and is not simply a quote recommendation that then somebody has to go seek out material from dispensaries where the quality and composition may not be clear. So some of the areas of research then I've already mentioned. We need a little bit more research on different methods of administration, more diverse populations, looking at specific cannabinoids, both naturally occurring and synthetic, studies on potential opioid-sparing effects of cannabinoids would be very important. And of course, we need to develop a much more precise understanding of dosing. CMCR actually is conducting a number of clinical trials now, and these are listed here. Based on these, hopefully we'll get more precise information on indications. Public safety studies are also quite important, and I've listed here a study on drugged driving that Dr. Marcotte is doing in our center. Well, that brings me to the end of this lecture. I thank you for your attention. If you would like to get more information about the CMCR's work or other relevant materials, such as the National Academy's report, other kinds of reports, please visit the CMCR website, which is listed there. Thank you very much.